Who knows where this is and what this is? Anyone recognise it? It's in London, in central London. All right, let's go to the next one. Does anyone recognise this? A little bit more local. See some smiles. Matilda, you should definitely recognise it. Yeah? Yes, the first one was the Royal Courts of Justice in Holborn. This one is Snaresbrook Crown Court. Maybe some of us have been there to visit or even to see something take place. Because what happens in buildings like this? Well, trials. People who've been accused of crimes are put on trial. And there are 4 stages to a trial. The charge, the examination, the verdict, and the sentence. The charge, well, we find out what crime this person has been accused of committing. The examination, evidence is looked at, witnesses are interviewed, and we work out what proof there is that the person did it or didn't do it. The verdict, the judge or jury announce their decision, whether they think there's enough evidence to prove that this person is guilty or whether they should be regarded as innocent. And then the sentence. If the person is found innocent, there is no sentence, they're free to go. And if they're found guilty, their punishment is read out. They might be ordered to pay back some money, return something they've stolen, do voluntary work, or even go to prison. And just before we sang, we read about Jesus' trial before Pilate. And Pilate was the Roman governor of Judea at the time. And Jesus' trial goes through these 4 stages. So we're going to try and follow those stages. And there's 2 things that we're going to see. The first is quite simply that Jesus was judged. Jesus was judged. So first of all, the charge. And we see that in chapter 23, verses 1 and 2. What do the Jewish leaders accuse Jesus of? Well, it says, the whole assembly rose and led Jesus off to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be Messiah, a king. So there's 3 accusations here, 3 things that Jesus is charged with doing. The first, confusing everyone. The second, commanding people not to pay their taxes. And the third, calling himself a king. 3 C's. Confusing people, commanding them not to pay taxes, and calling himself the king. Okay, the first one, they say that Jesus is confusing people, that he's misleading them, he's saying things that aren't true, that he's causing upset and disruption among the people. Second one, they say that he's commanding people not to pay tax. Everybody living in Judea and Galilee had to pay a bit of money each month or year to the Romans who governed over them, to Caesar. And Jesus, they said, was telling people not to pay it or that they shouldn't have to pay it. They shouldn't have to give their money to Caesar anymore. And then the third one, calling himself king. They said that Jesus is going around and he's telling everyone that he's the Messiah, the Christ, which they say for Pilate's benefit means king. Jesus is claiming to be a king, an imposter king. King instead of Caesar, who is king. So those are the 3 charges. But if you remember the beginning bit that we read, the Jewish trial, you might have noticed that they've changed their tune. Because there, the issue seems to be whether Jesus thinks that he's the Son of God in chapter 22, verse 70. But that doesn't get a mention here. They're trying to come up with charges that they think that Pilate will accept. So that's their charges. Next, we see the examination of Jesus, which really is just in verse 3 and 4. It's very short because Pilate can't find any evidence against Jesus. He finds no evidence that Jesus is confusing people. He might be teaching something different to what the Jewish leaders are teaching, but he isn't stirring up trouble or teaching things that are obviously wrong. And then second, Pilate can see that Jesus isn't commanding people not to pay tax. In fact, he's doing the opposite. In Luke chapter 20, we read that Jesus told people they should pay the tax they owe to Caesar, and they should give to God what they owe to him. And then the third accusation, that Jesus is claiming to be king, Pilate takes a bit more seriously. And he asks Jesus about it. Are you the king of the Jews? And of course, Jesus did think that he was the Messiah, which meant God's anointed king. Jesus did think that he was the king of the Jews and of all people. And he had been telling people and revealing who he was. But was he trying to replace Caesar? Was he trying to start a revolution and kick Caesar off his throne and be crowned king instead of Caesar? Well, no. Pilate could see that Jesus was not trying to do that. And so the examination was over. And then next came the verdict. This takes a little longer, from verse 4 through to verse 12. Does Pilate think Jesus is guilty of the things they've accused Jesus of? Well, it takes lots of verses, but actually it comes very quickly. It comes right at the beginning in verse 4. Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. Pilate can find no good reason, no evidence for the charges that they've made. Jesus is innocent. He doesn't deserve to die. But the Jewish leaders are not happy with this. They're determined that Jesus should be killed. Pilate sends Jesus to Herod Antipas. He was the son of Herod the Great, who was the one who had killed all the baby boys when Jesus was born. And Pilate sends Jesus to Herod for a second opinion, just in case. But Herod can't find any proof either. He questions Jesus, makes fun of him, and then sends him back, ultimately agreeing that Jesus didn't deserve to die. He was innocent. And that leaves us with the final part of this trial, and the longest part, the sentence. It goes from verse 13 right through to verse 25. What is to be done with Jesus? Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, you brought me this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I've examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he's done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and then release him. What will Pilate do with this man who's done nothing to deserve death? Well, he'll give Jesus a beating to satisfy the Jewish leaders, to teach Jesus not to get on their wrong side again. But then he will release him. He'll let this innocent man go free. But a crowd has gathered now. And what should have been simple and straightforward, the passage ending here with Jesus being set free, spirals into something terrible. Because instead of accepting the judge's verdict and sentence, and watching innocent Jesus have his handcuffs removed, make a brief statement to the press outside the court, and then go home, well, the crowd start to shout. In verse 18, away with this man. Release Barabbas to us. What? Barabbas? Who's Barabbas? Well, Barabbas, we learn in verse 19, had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Barabbas is a rebel and a murderer. He is guilty of most of what Jesus is being accused of, and worse. The crowd want Barabbas released. Well, Pilate appeals to them 2 more times. Why? What crime has this man, Jesus, committed? I'll have him punished and then release him. But crucify him, is all he hears in response. And then verse 24, Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who'd been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. The guilty man walks out of jail with his head held high, free to return to his life of crime, and the innocent man is handed over to be killed. It's a travesty of justice. Andrew Malkinson spent 17 years in prison for seriously attacking a woman by the side of a road near Manchester. His trial was in the year 2004, and he spent 17 years in prison for this crime. But he didn't do it. There hadn't been any actual proof that it was him. And then a couple of years ago, they found bits of another man's DNA, maybe flakes of his skin or hair, on the poor hurt woman's clothes. And they realized it wasn't him. Andrew Malkinson was innocent. And after 17 years in prison, he was set free. But Jesus didn't get set free. He was sent to the cross, and he was killed on it. Jesus was judged, but he was innocent. Luke wants us to see that as plain as day. Again and again, Pilate declared it. There was no basis for this charge, no evidence against him. Jesus had done nothing to deserve death. He should never have been put on trial. His trial should have been stopped at many different points through it. He should never have been sentenced to death. Jesus was judged, but Jesus was innocent. But I don't think that's the only thing that Luke wants us to see here. Our second point. Jesus will be the judge. Jesus will be the judge. Lurking beneath the surface of this account is a stunning picture of who Jesus is. Though Jesus barely answers these questions. These questions are like huge signs pointing to who he is. He doesn't really answer them, I think, because there's no point speaking the truth when no one wants to hear it and when no one's going to act rightly in response to it. And of course, because he knows that it's his Father's will that he go to the cross and that he dies. But even just in the questions being asked, we're reminded of just who Jesus is. As these names of Jesus come, one after the other: Messiah, Son of God, King of the Jews, of God's people. And then there's one question that Jesus does answer in a little bit more detail, though not how the Jewish leaders were expecting. It's in his Jewish trial before he meets Pilate, chapter 22, verse 67. If you are the Messiah, the Christ, they said, tell us. Jesus answered, if I tell you, you will not believe me, and if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. It may not seem all that exceptional, but in those 15 words, Jesus is saying something extraordinary. And he's taking their minds right back to the Old Testament scriptures. And he's saying, remember Psalm 110, the great song of David? The Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And he's saying, remember Daniel chapter 7. In my vision at night, Daniel wrote, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. From now on, says Jesus, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. You may think that you're seeing the end of me. You may think that you have won, that you're getting rid of me for good. You may think that this is it for Jesus of Nazareth and this gospel. But you are wrong. Jesus says to them, in this dark hour, he looks up. He sees ahead beyond his death, beyond his resurrection, beyond his ascension, to his exaltation, to his forever reign, and to his return in glory to judge the living and the dead. If you find the idea of me being Messiah and King of the Jews hard to stomach, just wait till you see me anointed Lord of all, hints Jesus in these words. For God's verdict on Jesus is clear. It's King. Though for now he's been judged guilty, Jesus will be the judge. And as we see in just that brief word, that subtle line, that Jesus is not so much judged as the judge, we see the camera flip around, and we see that it is not really Jesus who is on trial here, but the Jewish leaders and the Romans. For they will one day stand before God and give an account for what they did to Jesus. Luke wants us to see that Jesus is innocent, certainly. But I think he as much wants us to see that everyone else is guilty, that we are guilty. The Jewish leaders who hound Jesus with their accusations, unable to leave him alone, refusing to give up, are guilty. Herod, who makes fun of the Jesus, who won't just be his performing monkey, is guilty. Pilate, who knew Jesus was innocent and yet sentenced him to death anyway for an easier life, is guilty. Barabbas, who actually had led a rebellion and committed murder, is guilty. The crowd, who don't even give a reason why they want Jesus killed and Barabbas released, are guilty. There's not a friend or a follower of Jesus in this scene. No one stands up for him. No one defends him. No one protects him. Everyone else is guilty. And so are we. So are you. And so am I. Sometimes in life we say, you had to be there. We hear a funny story and it doesn't sound that funny to us. We watch a band or a singer from a festival on YouTube and it doesn't sound all that great. Or we see a photo of a famous view and we wonder why you would travel all that way just to see this. And you had to be there. The person who shared it with us tells us. And it can be easy to think with Jesus' death, I'm so glad I wasn't there, that it wasn't me, that I didn't see this, that I wasn't part of doing this, that I can't be blamed for it. But the Bible says that we're all guilty of killing Jesus. We didn't have to be there. Jesus died as a Passover sacrifice for all of our sin. He drank the cup of God's anger against all of our sin. We may not be the ones who sentenced him to death, who cried, "Crucify him," but that does not mean that we are innocent. We all, like sheep, have gone astray, Isaiah wrote. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We're all implicated. We're all on trial. We will all stand before God's throne, and we are all guilty. Were God to put me on trial, he'd say, this man, Matt, was brought to me as one who was rebelling against King Jesus, one who'd said, shove off, God, I'm in charge, no to your ways. I've examined him, God would say, and have found every basis for the charges against him. As you can see, he has done things that deserve hell. Therefore I will punish and not release him. That would be God's verdict on me. An eternal punishment and separation from him would be the sentence. What are we to do with this? The first thing is to just see our sin, to fall on our knees and to say sorry to God. Once when we first turned to Christ, but then every week, every day as we follow him, confessing our sin and begging for his mercy. And we're to see that God has made a way out. For Jesus is not yet the judge. He's looking to the future as he quotes that line from Psalm 110. Right now, he is still the judged. He's the one who left the Father's side, who came down, who was led like a lamb to the slaughter, who was silent as a sheep before its shearers. We're to see that God made a way out, that we can be, that we are, if we're already Christians, Barabbas in this story. Jesus has taken our punishment so we can receive his freedom. And as we worship Jesus as Messiah, as Son of God, as King, as one-day judge, and as he is sentenced to death, shoved to the floor, and hung up on that cross, we step out of our shackles, we shake off our chains, we walk out of sin's prison, and we go home, back into the arms of the God who is our Creator, the God who loved us enough to send his Son to die for us. We are Barabbas, and through Jesus, we've been set free.